Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Scale Up Podcast. My name's Jack, I'm the Managing Director here at BZBIT. I'm joined again today by Sam, our Technical Director, and I'm really excited to say that we've got our second ever guest on the podcast. He started his career in marketing, helping to scale a really successful MSP, and he's since started his own AI consultancy business. Really happy to have you on the podcast, Alex.
Thank you for having me on.
No problem at all. So we're going to start with you right back to the beginning, really. You've gone from kind of leading the marketing at high growth MSP in the sector that we're in. And now you've gone out on your own and you've kind of using that marketing experience, but you're also heavily leaning into AI and building your own consultancy in regards to that. You know, so we got a lot to cover about scaling a business. Take me back to that time, kind of when you joined that company. Like, what was the context? Where were you employed, and how was that kind of journey for you?
So I joined Cloud Direct. They were about 4 million of revenue, and I guess the background to that company sort of before I joined had been going for quite a while, more as a lifestyle business. And they started off originally as backup direct, so quite high volume, low value, selling backup, and had been very successful. And the founder had then seeked out investment, so had a number of private investors, and essentially was then starting that growth journey. And that's really the point at which I came on board, was to help take that business from where it had been to that next level of growth. So they were just starting to make a couple of acquisitions of smaller companies. Then when I joined, acquired another couple as well. And I joined as the only marketing person there. And as I expect we'll sort of get on to, ended up as marketing director with 3 different teams under me. And they were doing about 38 million of revenue when I left that business last year.
So that's a seriously scaling business. And that was over the period of about 8, 9, 10 years, was it?
7 or 8 years, yeah.
That is some serious scaling in that time. So must have been a clear kind of desire for growth with that new investor coming in. Had they had a track record of doing that? Was it quite an experienced board of a team, or was it just somebody kind of individually backing it?
Yeah, a mixture of both. So the founder and CEO was an experienced entrepreneur. He'd exited a couple of businesses, grown and exited a couple of businesses before. But as I said, this was run as a little bit more of a lifestyle business for him, and certainly the longest he'd kind of retained with the business and still going today. He had the experience, and then the investors were effectively a number of sort of individual serial investors, but other than that, no, it wasn't like a private equity where they sort of brought in a board of experienced people who were going to turn around the business, which made it really interesting, because I joined and got a voice straight away, and quite quickly became part of that senior leadership team. And then we all sort of went through that together, and people joined the business, some with more experience than others over time. But yeah, we were all kind of going on that journey together, which was really exciting.
Do you think the funding injection was quite a big catalyst in that growth, or do you think it would have happened regardless?
I don't think it would have happened to the same extent, because it enabled us to offer new services, probably just go faster and bigger than we necessarily would without it. But I also think there was a lot of culture. It was important in terms of that desire, in terms of everyone being on the same page, and people were joining that business because they were going on a growth journey, because they wanted to be part of a growing business. And the ability to do new things and try different strategies and have that kind of fail fast culture. And I remember when I joined, one of the first things my fellow director said to me was, the only thing you can do wrong is do nothing. And it was kind of that green light to say, go for it, try it. Don't necessarily bet the farm, but they want people who are going to try things and do things differently. So yes, that was accelerated by the investment, but there's also so much just in terms of that culture and that willingness to go for it.
It sounds quite unique in that sense, in that there's clearly, it sounds like a significant investment and somebody's put their money on the line there, but they've stuck with the maybe less experienced and internal team. And as you say, usually that level of investment comes with, right, here's your new board of directors, here's your new senior managers. And those senior managers are going out into the team kind of trying to gel, and it just creates friction and and you lose that culture. But it sounds like they almost betted on the internal team there and it's come off like really, really well if they've scaled to that level.
As I say, a friend of mine works in like pharmaceutical sales. And they had a private equity injection, and they didn't bring in a board, but they brought in a series of consultants who became very, very hands-on. And he essentially said that it robbed like a lot of the pleasure from the job as such. Like suddenly every decision is through a commercial lens to a really high entity degree. And people breathing down your neck, even though you're in high level directorship roles where you think you're just beholden to almost like a single board of shareholders as such. But in this instance, it's a whole team that they've parachuted in to represent themselves.
Yeah, and I think that's quite common, and you hear quite a lot of sort of similar stories where it doesn't necessarily always work. Obviously, it does a lot, but I think it also reflects the time frame that you're looking at, because they will typically, in that private equity, they'll go in and they'll have a sort of 2 to 5 year turnaround time frame, put the team in and have an exit. And this felt much more organic and authentic, and I think that was important for getting that culture. I think it was important for getting the teams that were involved on board, but also, as I said, we were making some acquisitions, so then you've also got to think about the people in those companies. They were quite small companies, but they're still becoming part of the bigger team, and also their customer base. And I think that culture was important there as well, because I think otherwise, if we were acquiring people, that the pure model was to get rid of them or to try and bring their customers into our way of working and not necessarily flexing and giving them the experience that they'd experienced before when they were working with a smaller business, then it wouldn't have worked.
Were there any standout kind of growth points in that journey, like so where you can just put your finger on it, or okay, we really got that right?
Yeah, I think there's a few. So first of all, going in was looking at that customer base, and as I say, they had quite a large customer base, but a lot of them were small. And then through the acquisition, so then we started to look at how we could sell more into the existing customer base and identifying that white space, and kind of that was certainly kind of one area. Then as we grew and as our skills and capability grew, the size of the customer started to grow, and then you start to get those bigger ticket wins. I think the one thing that was really fundamental was the relationship with Microsoft, and we were one of the first businesses to get the Microsoft Expert MSP, which is essentially it's an Azure accreditation, which at the time there wasn't many organizations that had that, and those that did were really super large organizations working in the enterprise, and that was really key for us to be able to go into the mid-market and to say, if you're thinking of moving to the cloud or thinking of moving to Azure, you need to do it with someone who understands the cloud, which not necessarily all MSPs did. They were more looking still at traditional IT and traditional on-prem at that point. And so that really was kind of the catalyst to be able to leverage the Microsoft relationship, both into our customer base, into new prospects, and getting referrals from Microsoft themselves.
Yeah, and in terms of, obviously that's a great one, and you kind of had that first mover advantage. Was that a defined strategy? Because obviously those things don't just pop up overnight. You must have had to put a lot of hard work and either a lot of investment or a lot of opportunity cost elsewhere that you're focusing on there to create that first mover advantage. Yeah,
I mean, the CEO would say that he kind of almost bullied his way onto that program with Microsoft, and yeah, there was a small team that really drove that forward of getting that accreditation. So it was very much a conscious strategy, and really that was seeing what's the next big move in the market, and that was ideal for me. My previous sort of background before that was working in MSPs, and part of the struggle with the previous MSP was they'd invested in a large data center, and it was really just at the time that everyone was sort of starting to move to cloud, and you could see how that business was really torn because they had sunk investment into the data center that they needed to cover, but the market was moving towards cloud, and there was a reluctance for them to migrate people to the cloud because they wanted to fill their data center, and I could see that happening. And so then actually to be able to go to an organization that was almost the flip side of that and saying, right, we're going to ride this wave and we're kind of at the start of that journey, then that was superb.
That's not easy to do when you're already at 4 million, 5 million. That isn't a small business. That's, I'm not saying it's massive, but it's decently sized. Like with those kind of bigger companies, it often is the roles are reversed a little bit, where they're more stuck in their ways and more risk adverse because they've got investments in X, Y, and Z.
I wonder what the catalyst would have been to go from a backup as a service business that's a lifestyle business doing 4 mil to a complete, front runner MSP from a technology perspective. That's quite a big shift, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, it's not my choice. That's the founder and the CEO. But I think he's very ambitious person, very, very interesting person as well, not only from a business perspective, but he's run all sorts of ultra marathons and things, and really sort of tries to push himself. I can't speak for him, and I probably shouldn't speak for him, but I know he had young children at one point, and as they grew up, I think he sort of put himself more into the business and saw the opportunity in front of him.
The reality for me now that we've kind of done that initial setting up phase is how I feel it is at the moment. But it's been a huge amount of effort and it's been a huge amount of cost. And now we're both starting families and we're both moving on to a new phase. It almost feels like that it will plateau for a few years while kids start to get established and life settles down and you go through that really difficult phase.
You become a parent yourself, I guess, as well. Like that's new.
And then I have to admit, I did half think, I bet you any money that whoever it is has had kids and then gone, do you know what? They're a little bit grown up. I can have my own thing now. They're back at school. They're back at this. They're back at that.
And we've seen that in a few clients, haven't we, where they've started to do mergers and acquisitions and started to really intentfully grow again. Is often that they are of the age where their kids have moved out and they're giving it that final push a little bit. But to come off in that sense must be, you must. But I suppose at that time of life as well, you've had multiple successes, multiple failures. You've learned probably a hell of a lot by that time, and you probably are in a better position.
Yeah, your contact network's huge. You've got capable people around you, people who believe in you because you've delivered in the past. There's a whole multitude of reasons as to why that would come off.
So what were your biggest challenges around that time?
In terms of at the start of that journey, do you mean?
Twofold, actually, kind of. You can answer it either way, like your personal challenges of your time at Cloud Direct, whether that's like kind of, if there's anything stand out in terms of you needed to hit certain numbers or certain, marketing activities that, was there any kind of challenges or stress in that, or from kind of a wider business perspective, were there any kind of big hurdles as a business that they had to overcome during that time that you've been there, start to finish?
Yeah, probably loads. I mean, it was...
I would struggle to answer it as well. We were saying this the other day, where generally things are less like huge moments and more just continuations of life, if you know what I mean.
You don't see the wood for the trees.
Yeah.
You're so far close in the detail, and you don't understand the significance of events until it's afterwards. Like you win a new contract and you think, great, new contract. And then we have one particular client that has then gone for an M&A, but weirdly the group bought the company and merged it, so it's now 3-4 times the size than what it was when we worked with it originally. And we purely do consultancy and implementation for them. We don't do any support. So yeah, the point being that we have access to technology where if we were originally speccing it, it would be like, well, it's £250 a month. To SMEs, that can be quite a significant spend just for a VPN appliance. And we're there like, well, not many would get it, but now we can sell the benefits straight away. And suddenly that £250 spend is worth it because we can actually explain the differences. And we only know that because of that one customer. That one customer is forcing us all the time to be leading. So yeah, you never know the significance of those moments, I suppose.
I think you're spot on with that, and you're right. You don't necessarily see the wood for trees. I know it's a horrible cliche, but it's completely true, and it's certainly something that I recognised when I came out of Cloud Direct that we'll touch on in a minute. But I think it is those things that you look back and you realise they were milestones, as you said, but actually at the time not necessarily. But things that, like, you win a new customer in a particular sector, and then you go, okay, well, let's now focus more on that sector, and you win another 2 or 3 clients in that sector, and suddenly you've got a whole sector play, and that takes your business in a certain direction. Or you do something. It's always funny the first time you sell something and you sort of think, oh my gosh, can we really sell it for this amount, or are people going to buy it? And then you do, and you suddenly go, wow, this is actually an opportunity here. And then you go and sort of turn that more into a product that you repeat. And the same, I remember a couple of the big hires, and maybe they thought about this when they brought me in initially as well, but you sort of make a couple of big hires, which at the time is, you know, the biggest salary that the business has had, or it's a really sort of big deal, which sort of then at 38 million and we're going, you look back and you think, oh, you know, we'll just bring someone on board, it's no big deal. But the first time you bring on someone on a big salary, and it's a gamble, and you think, is this going to pay off? Are we going to get return on investment? When are you going to get return on investment? From a marketing side of things, if that person is a consultant, then there's quite a lot of pressure to say, right, we need to go into their industry or their service area and really drive that. But you don't necessarily see those at the time, and it's only when you look back and you realize, yeah, there's lots of those things that shape the direction of travel and the growth,
and they just are in the day-to-day.
yeah.
I mean, you obviously, like you said, you progressed from marketing, whatever the role was initially, relatively junior, into marketing director. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is giving, you know, the audience something. If they are sat there and say they're 1, 2, 3 million turnover business, and they do have ambitious scaling ambitions, you know, might not be up to 39 million, but what were the kind of key, is there anything you can give from a kind of key takeaways point of view that you learned during that period?
Bring me in, obviously.
Yeah, bring you in as a consultant, and we'll get to that.
I think it's a case of working out, I mean, it sounds obvious, but working out what that strategy is, and where the opportunity for you is. And so an element of that comes from just doing what you're already doing. And then an element of that comes from saying, well, what's working and what can we amplify, and getting those foundations. So when I was brought in, part of that is to look at, well, what is the ideal customer that we want to work with? What's the demand in that market? How do we start to go after that? How do we identify those different streams of income? So you might be growing at the moment just by working on your customer base and kind of organic growth. So you then say, well, okay, that's one channel. How do we now drive more new customers? And we've got then that model. If you've got a good model of account management and growing your accounts, then how do we acquire more? And then how do you partner with people and drive that? So it's, again, a bit obvious and cliche, but it's about being conscious, I think, of where you're going to make those investments and where you're going to see that.
Being quite deliberate in it by the sounds of what you said, and nothing was kind of left for chance. Like it not a gamble, but you are being very, you're being quite disciplined and quite sure of what you're working on and where you're trying to take the business.
And I think it is that mindset of if you have to accept that you're going to take risks. You're going to have to accept that not everything is going to work out. And I mentioned earlier around that kind of fail fast. And sometimes that can be quite quick and easy, you know, run a paid per click campaign, and some of it will work, some of it won't. Some of it will be much bigger and much more strategic. And I was chatting to a sales trainer recently, and he was saying, one of the biggest frustrations is he sort of will go and work with a business, and they'll say, oh, we know we really need to do this, but we don't want to invest in it until we've won this big deal. So we know we've got enough money to pay for the sales training. And he's going, it's kind of chicken and egg, isn't it? Actually, you have to take the gamble, pay for the sales training, get your team working, and then it's going to follow. And it's the same with marketing, same sometimes with the partnerships, same with the investment in technology, that sometimes you have to take that leap of faith. And it's not about doing it blindly, it's doing it in a considered way, but it is about making that investment and accepting that you need to do that to achieve the growth. Otherwise, it's not going to come.
I think your point, the caveat is don't bet the farm. Like, it is knowing what is a catastrophic failure and what is something that's just, doesn't matter, we got that wrong, let's just move on.
And it is difficult, that balance, because the highest rewards ones are getting close to betting on the farm. If you see what I mean, like, it's, you can do the don't matter ones all day long, but they don't tend to be the ones that return the real investment. So I guess it sometimes can be quite hard to see which ones are, if we're going to make the decision that we're going to be an expert Azure MSP, that's going to take a hell of a lot of investment to get to, and what's the return on investment? But then you can't do what your old firm did and sit there and go, well, we've already decided on something that we kind of know is wrong, so we're just going to wait around, but our days are numbered. But that's the trickiness of a competitive business landscape that we work in and are all trying to scale businesses in.
I also think where they landed as being absolutely perfect is the skill set that they work in is a relatively unique skill set within the IT market. Like, even now, if you speak to 75% of engineers, they won't have any experience in Azure, and they'll still be primarily working in on-premise computing in some way. And obviously at that time, the cloud is the latest and greatest thing for mid-market, and it's suddenly become accessible due to a little bit of a drop in cost and a little bit more availability. And there's no resources to handle it. You are genuinely offering something that most mid-markets can't buy. They can't really employ for it because then they can't maintain the skill sets, or it's not accessible. So it is just a really well-placed time. And it probably still exists to some degree now, just not anywhere near in the depth that it did.
Yeah, that first mover on such a key infrastructure changes, obviously, but like, that's easy to point at, but the delivery behind that to execute that properly, there's a lot of devil in the detail, I'm sure. I've got two more questions before we move on to what you're doing today. I don't know if you'll be able to, it's putting you a bit on the spot, but what kind of lesson maybe did you learn from kind of your chapter at Cloud Direct that you still kind of use today?
I mean, there's loads, to be honest, because it was such a transformational time, both in terms of my career, but also the organisation as a whole. So to pinpoint kind of one or two things is difficult, but I think a lot of it I've touched on already. I think a lot of it is about being considerate around kind of what you're doing, getting the foundations right on which to build upon, making those informed bets, if you like. I had another one as well, but it's escaped from my head now.
Well, my final question was probably linked to that, because I was going to say, what's the biggest advice you'd give to somebody who's and I'm talking specifically marketing here, because obviously, our audience is primarily probably people who are trying to grow their businesses. So obviously, just leaning into the angle of you were a marketing director of a company that is scaled that well. Do you have a single best piece of advice to somebody who's maybe looking at their marketing, looking at how they could grow? Because this is, a podcast across industries, and I know we're talking about our industry here in the MSP world, but I'm sure there's pieces of advice that you could give that translate.
Yeah, again, it's hard to kind of pinpoint it down on one, but if you forced me to say one, it'd be speak to your customers, which again probably sounds obvious, but that's where you really get that understanding of what's the message that's going to resonate, what's the pain point, and that's how you can then start to replicate it and scale it. So, we touched on earlier some of those milestones of the first time you sell a particular product or the first time you get a customer from a particular industry. Well, that's gold then to understand, well, why did they buy that? What was the problem that they were solving? What was their decision to get to that point? Why did they nearly not buy from you? Why were they? What were they looking at to a competitor compared to you? There's so much insight you can get from that. And taking the conversation onto AI a little bit, that is still so true that you capture that information, and then that's the information that you can use to really amplify and leverage. So what I mean by that is, if you understand your customer, then you can build out a customer profile using your generative AI, and then use that to consult with and say, okay, I'm thinking of this proposition or this campaign or whatever it might be. How does it resonate with my ideal customer? You can start to pick out those nuggets of information and say, okay, which messaging is going to land better and which is not. And just going back to some of the stuff that Sam was talking about, one of the sort of areas that we landed on, for example, was identifying that you're right. You can't, you couldn't employ someone to do that because logistically it was an expensive resource to bring in. But also it's, well, what's your core business? And if you're going into a customer and saying your core business is whatever, legal advice, financial advice, IT support in your case, but it's then saying, so therefore, if you're investing quite significant time and money in anything outside of that, it's a distraction from your core. And we found that that message resonated more than just, oh, you can't afford it, and what if people have sick days? And you only really know that from actually speaking to the customers themselves and understanding, okay, that's the level at which they engage.
Which feels like a minor reframe from one thing to another, but still the same point.
Well, that's it. And I think, and that's ultimately what marketing is sometimes, is it's those minor changes where you think, well, this message makes sense to me because you're coming at it from a more logical perspective. But actually, if they're coming at it from a more emotional perspective, then the things that they're looking at are going to change. And I won't sort of go into too much of kind of the theory behind it, but there's things like category entry points, and that's the point at which someone is looking to buy your service. And again, within that, then you'll have different stakeholders, and they'll have different logical and emotional needs that they're going through. So only by, and that's kind of the theory and the frameworks that you would work to. But for someone who's not kind of in the marketing space, but is just a business owner, for example, then you can still do that, but you capture that information through speaking to your customers and through understanding what triggered them to make that choice, what were the decisions that they were making, and how did they come to that decision, and what were they deciding between? Because that's when then you can pinpoint your messaging.
I think one mistake we made early on was we approached both sales and marketing we hired quite a high level, but they weren't necessarily people that wanted to execute. So we hired thinkers rather than doers. And I feel like we had great plans. We always were like, what are we going to plan to do? And we'd sit there and we'd talk through who's the ideal buyer, what are they thinking about, and so on. And it wasn't until I realized we're actually not doing any of this after we've thought of it. And I do think that people get later in their career, they get more experienced, and then they try to get more away from getting their hands dirty, like just quite by instinct and quite by seniority. And that is quite a difficult, like, you mentioned chicken and egg problems earlier. It's a great example of one where you're like, well, do I hire someone to execute or do I hire someone to think? And the best laid plans don't matter if they're not actually executed upon.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it's a common one. And the obvious ideal answer is you have both, because I think the flip side is people make the mistake of bringing in an entry level person who's full of enthusiasm but not necessarily got that experience and can't necessarily apply that strategic thinking, and then you're doing activity but it's maybe pointed in the wrong direction, or it's not landing and you're kind of going through the motions almost. yeah, you're completely right as well. You can go too far the other side and have too much strategy, too much thinking, and not enough execution.
And it's almost like if you haven't got the budget to do the whole lot, then don't do it, because it is and you are 100% right. Like for us, it's always been, when we've gone into it and gone, well, the budget allows us to make one hire, so we're going to go with X. And then it is almost like, well, let's increase the budget and let's actually get the whole department built. And that's where we've seen the most success, rather than trying to kind of half invest in something, I suppose.
Probably goes back to your point with the sales training, that, you know, do the sales training or don't do the sales training, but don't kind of do it when you think there's going to be a magic money bit. It's a bit of risk and reward, I suppose, isn't it? I think the only other point, and it's a bit of a side point that just hit me when you were talking about speaking to your customers, you almost have that side benefit of building that trust with them a little bit as well. Like, I think we probably could do better. And we were talking about the new website launch, and speaking to customers and actually going and asking them, you know, have a play around, be on the development side. Does this speak to who you feel we are and what you'd be looking for? And sometimes you're a bit like, well, I kind of know better than them in terms of what their market is probably looking at, but at the same time, one, you don't, they'll give you lots of things, but two, it's a good trust building exercise to actually just go and speak to your customers as well.
Yeah, I think so, and I think you'd be surprised at some of the insights that you get from it. And when we did a website redevelopment project, for example, I mean, we put some money into a user experience consultant, but you could do this yourself as well. I mean, we did it through them. But the crux of it was sitting there and watching someone use your website and seeing how they navigate, and you give them sort of different tasks to do, and you soon realize what you think is the way that they will navigate, or the terms that you think that they will look for, are not actually what they use at all, because you're in your IT bubble and they're not.
Yeah. So we, as part of the redesign this time, the agency that we use said, do you guys use Microsoft Clarity? And I was like, never heard of it, when I had a look. And it literally is just a JavaScript add-in that just follows the mouse and shows you where the actual clicks happen. So you can see live sessions that happen. And we were on the website watching a session that had happened where someone had been on for a few minutes, so it was worthwhile watching. And it was only one of the initial ones. And they scrolled to the bottom and used the menu in the footer. And I was like, I've always said, can we take that out? It's a complete waste of space. And I was like, there's no way. Yeah. So it was actually a used link and quite common. And I thought,
that was just Alfie, because he knew that you were going to...
just Alfie messing with me. But yeah, you're right. It really, what is my minor reframe language is obviously significant in someone else's world, which we all just work differently. So it just is what it is. But
yeah, and another example along the lines of what you just said, I'm working for a company at the moment, and we've got a heat map on their website, and they've got their main service, and actually through this heat map you can realise that what they think is a kind of fairly minor service is actually the most popular service that people go and want to read about. So suddenly you go, actually, this is kind of low down on your list in terms of the business model and the marketing model, but this is actually what people want. And we only really knew that through seeing the heat map and getting the data behind it, and then being able to say, okay, well, actually, this is something we can push much more of. We can drive traffic for this service. We can push this service front and center. And then that's not just it's driving a bit more demand from a marketing perspective. That's shifting the direction of the business.
And in terms of when you were there and you were driving that, was there clear kind of KPIs in the marketing in terms of how that aligned to what the business wanted to achieve from a growth perspective?
Yes and no. So yes, there were KPIs and quarterly OKRs. So there's sort of that structure in place, but actually I'd say in reality, it becomes more from just working really closely with the CEO, having those regular conversations, being able to update the strategy and update the KPIs, because I think often KPIs are set with the best intention in the world, but they can actually be quite restrictive, because you normally end up setting them without really knowing what the answer should be, and you either massively overachieve or massively underachieve. So I think keeping them shorter, fluid, and more aligned to what's that key priority for the business and the organisation, and using it as a direction, but not getting too caught up on the number, perhaps.
The two biggest mistakes that we were having the discussion earlier on, that I feel in a management position I've made in the past 3 months, have been both because of being really explicit on the singularity of a target, and then essentially people I work with taking that extremely literally and being singularly focused on the single metric that I gave them, and then me being like, I don't understand the decision making there. And I'm like, you clearly communicated with me that you wanted me to meet that KPI, and I was like, yeah, I did, yeah.
But not at the cost of X, Y, and Z. Yeah.
But I think we're often guilty of this, where me and you in particular are often in constant discussion around what is happening in the business, what we're seeing, how we feel, so on. And it's just almost like there's a given that everyone else is in that same room, but they're just not. And the last 6 months have been quite, they've widened the gap in the comms quite a lot, haven't they?
Yeah, it's one of our, one of the biggest feedback that we had recently. We asked the team about OKRs and how they're working, and one of the biggest piece of feedbacks we've had, because they've slowed down a little bit and they've been lost in translation a little bit. And one of the biggest part of the feedback that we've got from staff is that they don't particularly miss the individual goal setting nature of OKRs, but they do miss the cross communication and actually knowing what's happening in other departments rather than their own role. They've missed that and found that really valuable. So it's definitely something we need to get back to addressing.
Because I think, and I've definitely been guilty of this in the past, that without that in place, and your OKRs are a really good example of driving that, it can feel like just the strategy is flip-flopping, and you're going, well, hang on, 1 minute you're saying this and then the next minute you're saying that. And I think having that sort of ribbon that goes through it, so you can explain and communicate either, yes, we are pivoting, or okay, we're going to try this alongside the thing that we're already doing, and being able to have those conversations in a way that, like you said, to you guys, we'll have that conversation, you'll be on the same wavelength, but the people who've not been in that room and just see the headline kind of just go, well, hang on, they came out of the boardroom last week, they said this, now they've come out of the boardroom this week and they've said that, and you've got loads of ideas, but if they're not being communicated in the right way, then it becomes a noise or distraction or confusion.
And you feel like you're having to communicate it all the time. You're like, I swear I've said this like 7 times, but it's, you've said it in this forum, in this forum, in this forum, but this person wasn't in there. And you start like, you're going to be wasting a lot of time. Cool. I mean, that I think does your time at Cloud Direct justice. Unless there's anything you kind of are screaming out that you want to talk about that, we'll move on. And I think, my first question would be like, at what point did you kind of go, I want to take the leap, I want to do something myself?
So what genuinely happened was, it's really, and I can say this, it's really intense when you're in that sort of environment, that sort of growth. And this is what I was talking around earlier about looking outside and that kind of wood for trees piece. And so we were growing, and you think you're going towards a particular goal. And actually when that goal is not necessarily realized, and you have to almost go again. And that's actually what Cloud Direct are doing now, is they're going for their next phase of growth. And you're kind of just exhausted. You go, well, we've grown so much, and without an end in sight, you can't necessarily carry that on. I mean, I was there 8 years and, gone through that great transformation. But you are in the thick of it and you don't necessarily look outside. And I think I kind of got to that point where I thought, well, what's next? And I remember going for a role for a very similar company in a marketing director role, and I ended up pulling out and just going, it just doesn't excite me going and do the same thing again. And so I realized I wanted something new, I wanted something different, and it was almost at that point where, as I was saying earlier about the business I was in, who were struggling to move to the cloud, and so I moved to a business that was doing the cloud, and it's almost the same now with AI, that I'm kind of at that eve of, I can see that there's a huge opportunity around AI, and that's going to transform business, society, etc. So really it was a case of sort of identifying that opportunity to say, I want to do something on my own. I want to try something new. I want to kind of figure out what direction that is. I know that it's got to be something AI related, because that's just the way that the market is going, and it's such a big opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, you'd summarize that as you joined Cloud Direct at a time when cloud computing was coming in, and that phase felt like it came to an end, or is coming to an end, and AI is the next cycle, and you wanted to be back at the beginning of the journey, not the end.
And what kind of assumptions did you have about going out on your own, and what's been harder than you kind of expected?
I mean, it's hard. It's hard. Enjoyable, rewarding. I think, and I'm probably still in a honeymoon period with it as well. I've taken quite a lot of time off. It's been hugely challenging and exciting and rewarding in kind of equal measures. I mean, I think in terms of what's been the most challenging, I think is just the speed of the sales cycle, because where we worked, in Cloud Direct, we're working on, by the end of it, quite large projects. So you expect a very long sales cycle. I'm dealing with smaller customers typically now, but the sales cycle is still quite long, and that's
we say the same thing, that like for us, we pride ourselves on like agility, and we, you mentioned board meetings, and like we just message each other and talk about it in our private lives and whatever, because we're that sad. But I would say that has the added benefit of decisions get turned around quite quick, and we don't really sit on things for very long.
Yeah, we're not waiting for next Thursday's SMT to make a decision.
So like, I know when we went out for the website, you've had 3 different bids, all evaluated into second stage, and like closed off within like a week and a half, 2 weeks on it, really. Which still doing due diligence, but not sitting on things forever.
You have all the information that you're going to have to make a decision. It's not about not getting the information. It's about getting that information thoroughly, quickly, and making the decision. So, yeah.
Yeah. And, we're obviously involved in a kind of similar sales cycle to you. And it's often, such and such is back in from their holiday, and we've got to have a meeting, but then this person's out, and so on and so forth. And before you know it, it genuinely is like 4 or 5 months before even serious conversations are starting to be had, and we're just not used to it. We're kind of used to that go.
If you take that example that you had of the website, you probably actually kicked off that conversation months, maybe even years ago, of, oh, we should do something with the website. And with my marketing hat on, and I can't remember off my head what the stats are, but it's of 80% of the winning provider is the first person that you spoke to. And there's this idea of the day one list. So again, if you take that example and you say, right, we think one day we're going to create a new website, who are the top 3 to 5 people that can do that come to mind? And that's you'll end up going with someone on your day one list. So from a marketing perspective, you need to be engaged really early, so that you're early in that conversation. You're one of the first people they're speaking to, and you're front of mind. So I'm very conscious of that. So I'm having conversations with businesses when they're at the start of their AI journey, or the start of thinking about bringing in a growth consultant,
which could be a couple of years off.
Exactly. So to me, it then feels really slow, because I'm having this conversation, and it's when the actual decision is made, it can often be like your example, it can be made quite quickly, but they're not necessarily ready to make that decision for some time. But I want to be present whilst they're going through that process, because no doubt, again, I'm sort of just using this because you threw it out as an example, but no doubt before you pulled the trigger on someone to work with, you had lots of questions about, well, what is a good website? How much should we spend on a website? Do people actually come to us organically, or is it just more of a brochure? What role does the website play in your business? And do we want it to have any particular features like a chatbot? All of those sorts of things that before you pull the trigger, you would be thinking about over a number of months in advance. And so being part of that conversation is interesting to me, but also I know it's valuable from a growth perspective. But obviously when you're kind of starting out and you're having all of those conversations, that's a lot of unpaid work that you're
and time you've got to wait on your own personal set. Yeah. Do you feel like there's any kind of particular barriers within that long process, or is it's just a long process?
I mean, I think an element is it's just a long process, and I think it's about priorities of the business, and certainly from an AI perspective, and I'm sort of very biased on this, obviously, but I think it's often wrong to look at AI in isolation and say, well, that's a project that we'll do, because actually I think it's so wide and touches every single part of the business. And I've used this analogy a few times, that it's almost like saying, well, we're not going to do anything until the IT team has implemented the internet. But actually, effectively, your business strategy is defined by the internet. And if you go back to the dawn of the internet, that would be deciding, do you do e-commerce, for example? It decides how you speak to your customers, how you work with your partners, how you interact, whether your staff are based in an office or whether they're from home. And I think AI is the same. If you just say, well, we'll do AI one day once the IT team's got round to it, then you're missing out on so much opportunity to say, well, actually, how does the marketing team use it? How does it change and speed up and improve our win rate, or the sales process? Does it enable us to offer new products? And it doesn't need to be big change and transformation, but it also shouldn't really be something that's parked. I don't know if that answered the question at all.
I think it really does kind of resonate with me as well, because obviously most AI services are kind of either licensed through our commercial model, or in some way we would be expected to engage in that process. And, we do have knowledge within the business of business processes and technology and everything else, but really they're just the conduit or the kind of scaffolding that holds in place those processes. And for us, like, we're not the go-to leading expert on how you can build this business process from end to end. And yet I imagine that a huge amount of the market is probably looking at MSPs to at least assist in delivering that. And that is a huge weight. You're moving the demarcation point from, when I started in IT 10, 12 years ago, even longer now, the line was, well, in fact, you go back even further when Drag started in IT, and Drag tells me stories about they had no remote support, and it would be a technician would be just dispatched on a rota to the site, to the business in question, and they would turn up, fix the issues and go home for the day. So it was almost like, a recruitment business rather than a model. And then suddenly advent of more of a kind of connected internet, remote support tools become available, and then it becomes that kind of centralized help desk model, or whichever way you want to describe it. And then you move on to now, and I feel like a huge amount of cybersecurity has fallen into MSP's laps that didn't used to exist within our remit. Huge amount of compliance with 27001, and inputting on other areas of the business as well. And now AI feels like another one in there. And expecting to deliver that at the price point that most UK MSPs work at means that really it's just a degraduation of margin or service quality. It's always going to be one or the other. And I don't really know how we deal with that.
Yeah, and a lot of the conversations I'm having is around the role of leadership when it comes to AI, because I think, as I said, you can't just outsource it, and you've kind of touched on there that there is, I think there's huge opportunity for MSPs around delivering some of these services. And I think it's probably the biggest opportunity to bridge that conversation between business and IT. And I think I remember saying to you before that the things that as an IT company you think are important and you're having conversations with every day, normal people aren't. I think most people are talking about AI to some shape or form. I think you go to a dinner party and people do talk about AI. I've never been to a dinner party where someone talks about cybersecurity or cloud. So I think I think it is real. I think it is an opportunity for MSPs. But I think the biggest thing for me is that business leaders need to own this. They need to decide what are they comfortable with using AI for, and what they're not. What are the guardrails and guidelines that they're putting in place? How do they make sure that it's done in a secure and compliant way? And that's with the leaders. How do they create the right culture for that innovation and for the acceptance that this is not a piece of software that is binary of either you have it or you don't, or it does something or it doesn't. It's a completely different way of working, and that's something that people need to learn. It's something people need to fail and improve as they go through. So you need to create that culture in which to do it, and look at how does this become part of the way that we run the business and the expectations that you put on teams. Is it part of your regular reviews with your staff? Have they got goals in which they should be using AI to improve the work that they're doing, or certain workflows? So all of these conversations are business and leadership conversations. They're not IT conversations.
I saw a news article last week that said Accenture had sent out an internal memo to staff saying if you want a promotion or you want career progression, we're monitoring AI usage. And if yours is low, then you won't be considered for roles.
Yeah, someone sent me that this morning, actually. I think the intention is right. I think there should be something in your reviews and your expectations around using AI, and that's only the headline. I'm sure there's more nuance behind it, but on the face of it, you go, well, then you're driving using AI for the sake of driving using AI, and usage could be you're just using it in the same way that you use Google, or a calculator. Exactly. It just usage there of itself is not actually the correct measurement, because you can use it, but you can use it in the wrong way or in an inefficient way.
And in a lazy way. We discussed this the other day, that, a lot of usage of it at the moment is sometimes overreaching and sometimes laziness. And, we've had this has never happened before, but more and more clients being kind of like, well, what about this, or this project should, I've asked ChatGPT, this project should take you 2 days, not 5 days, not knowing anything about their own infrastructure or prompting AI in any way. That it's just giving them a generic steer. And there's things like, we call it well-written waffle, where, things are coming back what used to be pretty obvious to pinpoint that that's a load of rubbish, you haven't put any time on it, to now it's kind of, oh, that looks good, and then you read it and it's like it doesn't align to your business goals, or it doesn't align to your, and it isn't, like you say, isn't just using AI. There is onus on leadership to be able to go, this is what we need to use AI for, and it's to build the fabrics of our company efficiently, quickly, to deliver service better, and so on. Tell us a little bit then about Brightkill AI and what you're looking to do with that.
So with Brightkill AI, I'm working with SMBs to help them understand how they can get started on this AI journey. And it touches on a lot of the conversation that we've just had, that I've seen this, or I see there's an opportunity where small and medium-sized businesses are going to need to get started with this. I don't think MSPs are in the place to directly deliver it themselves, and there's not necessarily anyone else providing those answers. So we have 3 pillars. One is around consultancy, so running an audit and a roadmap for the organization and helping them understand what are the opportunities, what does AI look like for in their business. The other is training, so working with leadership teams and with others in the business, and that can be both training on the tools, but also some of the things that we were talking around earlier, kind of leadership expectations and the role of leadership in AI adoption, and then working with partners to implement. So that could be automation or building out AI agents, depending on the roadmap. But I think the key thing for me, and I often sort of walk through a maturity model with organizations, is understanding where they are and what's the logical next step, and not feeling overwhelmed by looking at a fully autonomous agent run business, because let's be honest, most organizations are not there, and most SMBs are not going to be there anytime soon.
Yeah, I think it's a good place to be, because like you said, it's difficult to deliver internally. It's difficult to ask your outsourced IT provider to deliver for you, especially when so much is cultural and ingrained in how your staff are trained and so on. I think that will develop, and like you said, I think there's definitely opportunities for MSPs. But there is also, like we said, with the Cloud Direct stuff, there's first mover advantage on this stuff. If you're in your industry and you're using AI genuinely well across your organization, then there's definitely a gap in the market for that.
Our experience, like in the past, like short period of time, we obviously use Teams subscription of ChatGPT. We have recently linked up company knowledge sources and done the whole kind of aspect of setting up, which we were quite late to because we didn't really want to pollute it with our data straight away. And we've worked through a few tenders now using it more intently, mostly for idea generation and pulling out themes. And I think the realization for me is it hasn't really saved us time, but it has improved our quality quite dramatically. Which I actually kind of, when I think of automation, I always think of like, taking 20 hours of human time and making it 1 hour or whatever. So I think for me, it's almost like automation shouldn't be banding in the same sentence as artificial intelligence, and that actually they are obviously distinct topics, clearly, but perhaps the goal of AI isn't just to take tasks away from humans, but it is really to support them.
Yeah, I mean, I see that a lot, and I think that example that you gave of responding to a tender is a really good example there, where it can save time, but it just allows you to do things that realistically a small business wouldn't be able to do, and that might be where. And I think a lot of the downfall is people go, write me a tender response. And it's a bit like you said earlier, that on the face of it, you go, oh, wow, look, that's great. And then you read it and you go, actually, it's absolute nonsense. But what you can do is start to say, well, what is the process we go through? Workflow that process and understand, well, how can I use AI at different points? And it might be that AI isn't the answer for some of those stages, but there are other bits where it is. So you might say, right, we'll build an ICP of our ideal customer and we'll test with them. We'll use another agent to research the customer. We'll use someone else to work as a consultant that I converse with and I go back and forth and I stress test my ideas for. I then have someone else who helps me, or when I say someone else, another AI assistant that helps me construct this and pull through the policies that they've asked for, because they always ask for the same policies, for example, and you're currently copying and pasting from the previous tender version. So those sorts of efficiency. And then at the end of it, you stress test it back and say, okay, this is what we've got. Now cross-reference it with not just the tender that they provided, but also the call transcripts from the conversations that we've had, and some of those more emotional things, going back to your marketing sort of hat on, some of those more emotional things that maybe didn't make it through to the tender, but that are actually important to the decision makers, and make sure that those are included in your tender. So you can see how kind of you go through that process. And as you say, it's not necessarily saving you time, but it's allowing you as a small business to do what an enterprise would have had a team of people doing. So you spend the same amount or maybe more time on it, but you give yourself a much better result at the end of it.
I have to admit, the first one that we kind of thought, let's give this a little bit of a punt with, and let's get together a little bit of a knowledge base of what we felt were our best tenders that we've put together like manually over the past 2 years. And let's give it a punt with this first one. I spent maybe 3 or 4 hours just prompting. And then I was like, I'm never going to get this done. So I then realized that, I probably had approached this slightly wrong, and that where I thought I was just going to be able to get this to generate text for me, that really wasn't the use case. But I did learn loads about the fact that we need to improve the structure, the fact that we need to say different things, the fact that just things that just didn't really hit me at all. And it's not always right. It is ideas, and it does still require critical thinking. And that might well change in the next 10 years, who knows? But at the moment, I still feel I'm right more than it is.
Yeah, and I guess that must be part of your training when you go into these firms, and being like, it isn't just relying on AI. It's the training element is like you working with the AI to implement really your own ideas, and it's the evolution maybe is done in support with AI, but it isn't about, like you said earlier, isn't about just getting AI to do it for you. It's actually getting AI to supplement it with you.
But it feels like a total paradigm shift from the way you work. Feels like completely rewriting the rules as to how to respond to an essay. You know, you literally spent your entire educational system life with, I remember it hit me at like 17. I mean, if I write out the headings first and then fill in the text, my answers are way better structured. And you know, you've gone through all that learning cycle, and now you've got here and you've gone, I'm just going to dramatically all of a sudden change everything about the way that I would respond to an essay.
Feels a bit disarming at times if you've gone through that learning process as well, I suppose. If you've become a good writer, or you've become a good whatever in your discipline, and that knowledge is now easily accessible, but sometimes, like I said before, the example is where it isn't that accessible as people think, and it's you can, like I said earlier with the example, you can start to question things or get things wrong because you've felt like you've had a window into that knowledge that you really haven't had the depth of to be able to draw that conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I would always talk about, is you still need the expert. You still need to know the domain to know whether it's hallucinating, but also to know what good looks like. But to your point, Sam, I mean, it is a different way of working, and you're expecting people to use a tool and interact with a tool, often without any training, and often just sort of given the tool, and that's where kind of the downfall can come, because it is a different way of thinking, and it's certainly uncharted territory for leaders to lead through this change as well.
I'm not going to say we have clients, because I don't want to talk derogatory about clients, but in the past, probably not when I've been here, because it is when I was closer to support. Obviously, there are some elements if you get a call and it would very visibly be someone who can't actually, or doesn't really know how to use a computer. That's the level of like technical proficiency in some organizations. And I feel like, you know, maybe the difference between an organization that doesn't really know how to get the most from Word and the one that does know how to get the most from Word probably isn't a huge competitive advantage, if that makes sense. Yeah. But this one feels different to me. This one feels like if you can harness and leverage AI, there is a hugely profound productivity, quality, everything gain versus someone who can't.
I think there is. I genuinely think there is. But I also think statements like that can feel quite scary and quite overwhelming. And so part of what I'm really trying to do is help people take the first step or the second step or the third step, and not sort of look at saying, oh my gosh, I need to be a completely sort of AI autonomous business, but actually start to identify what does it mean for your organization, and how do you approach the work that you're doing? How do you start thinking about things? So the example that we talked through earlier, it's breaking down that task of saying, well, it's not just responding to a tender, is it? It's looking at all of the different steps that are involved in that. And I was chatting to someone this morning, and it was sort of their words saying to me that actually a lot of what I'm doing is advising not just on AI, but on where not to use AI and other changes that are needed in the organization, because there's only so far that AI can take you. If you don't have the right people or the right data or the right processes, then AI is still not going to get you there. So it's, and this is where I keep coming back to this point, that AI shouldn't be seen as a technology. It's for the business and the leaders to understand it enough to be able to think about how it impacts their business and how they use it in their business.
Do you think there will be, because the second part to that kind of out there point that I made was going to be, do you think there's almost a gradient to adoption? Do you think you'll have kind of those that are extremely mature and then those that are still early in their journey? Or is the reality that the mature ones will probably dominate the market quite quickly?
100% there's a gradient. And I think I mentioned earlier, I kind of talked through the maturity model of kind of how you've adopted it and how you use it as your organization. I think there will be organizations that are kind of AI native and that spring up and are just pretty much sort of run on AI, or everything they do is run on AI, and those are going to be quite disruptive into the market. Then I think you'll have organizations that fall by the wayside. I think you will, sadly, and I think you'll end up with the vast majority in the middle, who are kind of long established organizations that just use AI to be more effective in the way that we've described.
Is that one of the questions that we kind of posed to the staff a while back was, has AI made it harder or easier? And I think the reality of that was, what came out of that point was, it's made it harder because we've had to learn new skills and we've had to learn a new way of working. And it's still very, very early in that growth journey, but it's very clear that things are going to change. And as I say, I think the productivity difference between using it and not using it will be sufficient that it is like market competition. And if people aren't using it and aren't able to create competitive advantage, then they're not going to be competitive.
Yeah, and our salesperson always says, people buy when they have a pain point, and there maybe is a little bit of need of, it does scare people enough to act, I guess. And I don't know if that is obviously a marketing person, I don't know if that's a good lever to pull. But I guess you've done a lot. You've done work with businesses now, you've done networking, you've got your own podcast. You've definitely got your ear on the ground of how people and leaders are feeling. You said, obviously, maybe at dinner party, I'm not sure. But what's your kind of view like of what business leaders are thinking about AI right now? Are they fully in, skeptical? Like, what's the feeling on the ground at the moment?
I mean, I'm talking to people across the whole spectrum. So there are people who are fearful, not really sure how to get started. Some that are more willing or keen to get started than others. I think it's changing already. I'm seeing sort of quite a lot of change, both in terms of the starting point for organisations, but also kind of the way in which they're thinking. So I think I mentioned earlier. So I'm sort of seeing people almost in two camps of one of that side of looking at it a bit more. What does it mean for my business? How do I sort of make get successful adoption? And then those that have got a particular workflow, a particular problem, or a particular process that they know is inefficient, and they want to look at how can we use AI and automation to improve that.
I always think those ones, for me, like really devalue AI. And what I mean by that is, like, one that I always hear banded around is always stuff like our sales orders or our supplier forms or whatever. And they always use some level of OCR and AI to lift information and do data entry. And it's all about how they've automated Gladys out of a role or whatever. And you're always like, yeah, okay, I get it. But they've got to be relatively few businesses that still do that. Like, most tools like Dext or whatever will have some level of processing in it. And
it hasn't gone from manual spreadsheets to full AI overnight.
Yeah. So I get that case exists, but I personally am way more interested in the first point you made of how much it can improve quality and how much it can improve ideas and just brainstorming and communication and just everything. One part that I find really difficult personally is when new models are released. And essentially, like most people, we run on cloud services rather than our own. And suddenly you feel like you're talking to a different person. And that kind of, not rapport, but that if you and I are having a conversation, I build an idea of how empathetic you are, how kind you are, how friendly you are, and then next week you come in again, but you're a totally different person, I would find that extremely unnerving, right? And that is what has happened between, in OpenAI's case, the models 5.1, 5.2 have felt extremely different to me. And that has led to me feeling quite uncomfortable with how much I'm reliant on those services if they could just be withdrawn that quickly.
They haven't been withdrawn. and it is ultimately just a machine that's driven by numbers and codes. But I know what you mean. Your expectations of it has changed. But again, that kind of comes with how you interact with the tool and how you use it, and making sure that you've got that clear knowledge on which to educate it with. And that some of that knowledge is, you said you've linked it into some of your folders and your files, for example. But also some of it is the foundations for you as a business. So again, from a marketing perspective, I would say you can't use AI unless you've got your own clarity on what's your tone of voice, who's your ideal customer, what are your key messages, all of those strategic things, because that's what ultimately you're feeding it with, and you're giving that knowledge, and you're iterating continually with the models to make sure that they're honed and they're trained on what you're doing.
If you had to put you on the spot, where are kind of leaders overestimating it and underestimating it?
That's a good question, because they're probably doing both simultaneously. In that I think they're hearing the headlines and kind of overestimating how quickly, easily, and transformational it's going to be. And I had one person say, "Well, do I need anyone in marketing, or can I just have a fully sort of AI running it?" And again, I came back to that point of, well, yeah, but you've currently got no marketing strategy. You haven't sort of defined who your audience is and what your message is.
And it's your point, it's not a technology, it's
it's something that can amplify and leverage what you're doing. On the other extreme, I think people underestimate what can be done with the really accessible tools like Copilot, Claude, ChatGPT, because I heard a stat recently that 95%, or another stat was 3/4 of people are just using it like Google, so they're just using it as a search engine, and that's massively sort of underestimating the capability of it, and really thinking about how, with fairly low investment of time, effort, and money, you can equip your teams to start doing these things and using the tools properly.
You mentioned earlier fear as kind of an emotion towards like the concept of AI, and I didn't bring it back, but I thought it was quite an interesting word. Where does the fear come from, do you think?
I'm seeing the fear in probably multiple areas, but one is overwhelm. I think that's probably the most real that I see, that people just, and I feel overwhelmed. I'm in this AI bubble, and it feels like this constant arms race of who's using which model and how you keep up.
You see some of the like articles of people pulling 18-hour days in Silicon Valley trying to be at the front of it and everything else, and you're there like, this is moving so fast.
Yeah, I mean, let's come back to that, because that's a really interesting point. So I think there's fear in terms of overwhelm. I think there's definitely fear around data, and compliance and governance, and I think there's fear around losing jobs, and I think there's fear of losing control as well. I think everyone's had that experience we talked about a couple of times, where you say, write me a press release, and you think, oh, this looks good, and then you look at it and you go, actually, it's complete nonsense. Doesn't sound like us. It clearly is written by ChatGPT. It's not something we want to say.
I think as the leader, that's been really difficult for me personally, where I'm like, again, you said earlier, like the typical, I can smell it. Like I know it's there because it's bad grammar or because it's this, but all of those typical things, those typical alarm bells are gone, and it can be just really well written nonsense that you're there like, oh yeah, that looks fine. Yeah, no problem. Put that out to 1,000 people on our mail shot or whatever. And before you know it, you've completely lost control of like your brand tone, your messaging, what you're trying to say. And more content's being produced because we're more productive.
And I think, again, I got sort of multiple answers to that, because I was chatting to someone recently around kind of that quantity piece, that there's an opportunity to produce more, and the key thing is making sure you're not just producing more for the sake of it and more drivel, but actually if you can be more strategic with that and say, well, actually we can take one piece of content and we can now produce that to resonate at different stages of the buying cycle, to resonate with different decision makers. So, right, we've got the same piece, but this is for IT leaders, this is for finance leaders, and this is for marketing leaders, for example, or industry, or any combination of those, then actually you're not just creating, right, I can do 1,000 blogs about this topic instead of one, but actually you're saying I can do one good piece, but I can make it really personalized and relevant to the person that you're talking to. And then just picking up on some of the other things that you said. So I'm working with a PR agency at the moment, and there's again steps to that journey that they're going to go on. So one thing is just making sure that they've got clarity on the tone of voice, and then they've got an AI agent that really understands their tone of voice. So they have it embedded in the models so that if they're using it to produce stuff, it's the right tone of voice. But then they've also got someone who, I keep saying someone, I mean an AI assistant, who just does that and is critical. And you basically feed it in and say, right, now cross-reference this with our tone of voice and be really critical about where it drifts and where does it not reflect us. But one of the things on the roadmap with that organization is to build a second brain of the founders. So when we did the audit with them, one of the big sort of challenges they were finding was the founders were a bottleneck because everyone had to go to them to check things or ask their opinion on things or get input. So actually we've agreed with them that essentially we're going to create a second brain. And again, it works as that AI assistant that you say, right, now, before I send it to the MD, think like the MD would think, critique this, and then actually you then skim some off the bottom that just never needs to go to the MD. And again, this comes back to leadership and guidelines around, well, what does the MD need to see and what doesn't it? Where are we comfortable using AI? Where are we not? Where are we comfortable using AI with a human in the loop? So all of those decisions need to be made. But in this case, it skims some off the bottom, and then it means what has gone to them, you can say was already gone through. These were the points that our AI model made that we think you would flag. Is there anything else? And it just speeds up that whole process.
Yeah, very interesting. And then in terms of coming back out of AI, then specifically in terms of what you're doing, obviously on this podcast, we like to kind of share the business side as well as like the technically what you're doing. Kind of what does the next few years look like for you? What are you hoping to achieve?
I'm still sort of figuring that out, in all honesty. So I think there is a big change for organizations. I mean, a really waffly answer, but I guess ultimately success and what this means for me is finding somewhere that I can add value. And I know that sounds like a really glib answer, but it's such a big topic. There's so many different dimensions to it, from technical to training to kind of strategic. And organizations are at many, many different stages of their maturity. And I guess success for me is finding that sweet spot where I can add value and where I can leverage my experience in growing organizations, my experience as a commercial leader with that knowledge and experience of AI, and combine those and help those organizations navigate their way through.
Yeah, really good answer. And, you know, from a personal perspective, how have you found kind of running and leading a business, and is it giving you kind of that kick that you wanted, that like motivation? Or have you know, we spoke the other day where Drag, obviously when he started the company, had 3 children. Sam didn't have any, he was mid-20s. We're now all parents. You have a couple of young ones and a family. How have you found like going out on a venture by yourself, trying to grow something? You found it stressful, risky, exciting, probably everything in between, I imagine.
Yeah, I'm laughing because I remember started a side hustle quite a few years ago now with a friend of mine, and he had 2 young kids at the time, and I didn't, and I was in my 20s, and we're still really great mates now, you know, best mates, but it didn't really go anywhere. And part of the reason it didn't go anywhere was because the expectations and the time that we were putting into that were, you know, poles apart. And I kind of now massively sympathize and empathize with him of kind of, oh, actually now I realize that it wasn't just you being lazy, it was that you're trying to keep 2 little people alive, you know. It's so yeah, it's hard. It's a big balance of my time. I've got that benefit of freedom and how I use the time. And there's definitely an element of excitement of, learning something new. I'm learning all the time. I'm trying different things, having those conversations. But there's no off days in it, is there?
No, and I even from my perspective, there's that little bit of guilt complex even in your spare time, that you now don't have a defined spare time, and that's sometimes good. Like you said, sometimes it gives you flexibility in that, and sometimes it's not so good because you don't know, you don't have that 9 till 5:30. They're my work hours, then I go. So it has its pros and cons, but I'm glad you're enjoying it, and I'm glad it sounds like it's giving you that. Not kick, but like kind of it's giving you what you wanted to have from it so far, at least.
Yeah, and I think that time and the hours that you mentioned is something that I'm still grappling with and learning with. Actually, I'm not defined by having to work 9 to 5. So I know, and I've always known in myself that I work better in the evenings, for example. And often when I was working for another organisation, that would mean I work 9 till 5. And then I would also work in the evening as well, sometimes out of necessity, but also sometimes because you'd be in meetings all day or you'd not be as productive in the daytime. Whereas now, if I'm having a day I'm not so productive, I just go, well, that's fine. I'm not accountable to anyone to actually work during these hours. If I'm not working now, I'll work in the evening. And I was speaking to someone recently who's a burnout coach called Johnny. I'll give you his details actually, because he'd be a great podcast guest. And he was talking about sort of being intentional with your hours and what's most important to you. And he was saying he was working with a client who sort of said, oh, well, the most important thing, the reason I do all of this is for my family and for my kids, etc. And he said, well, no, you don't. And the bloke sort of said, what do you mean I do? He said, no, you don't. He said, show me your diary. He said, not once on here have you got any time allocated for your kids. And you suddenly go, actually, yeah, I can block out an hour at 4 o'clock to play games with my kids and then make up that hour later on when they're in bed. And it doesn't always work out like that, but it's having that freedom and also the conscious sort of initiation to do it.
Yeah, one of the difficult things for me for that has always been the facade of being a leader. And I remember 18 months ago, I got into a bit more of a flexible working pattern, and I was like, you know what, I don't really understand why I'm going to the gym at 7 o'clock in the morning to then be out for 8, start at 8, and then work in the evening. And it was like, it just make more sense for me if I went to the gym a little bit later and then reworked my hours, still working more hours than most people, whatever else. And it genuinely took a week before one of the people here said to me, oh, nice of you to roll in, isn't it? And you're then like, it just knocks you for 6. As soon as you get that challenge from someone you work with, you then just start going, oh yeah, I need to present a much better idea of what it's like to be in this position, and I've got to be seen to be working 15 hours a week 15 hours a day. And
it's difficult, I guess, because Alex hasn't embarked on, and I don't know if that is part of your future, to employ people, build a team, culture.
Yeah. It was way easier for me when it was early days and we were kind of like around the place and there wasn't any of that expectation.
Because employees don't have that flexibility because we have servicing hours, and because they have a flexibility to a degree, but like you're saying, one of the benefits of moving from being employed to self-employed is the real flexibility, because you don't have a team to work with that you need to align hours. I guess you're kind of saying.
I'm saying the exact same thing, but I've lost it because I'm trying to manage perceptions.
So don't build a team, Alex, or you'll lose that benefit.
And one thing someone said to me early on is you lose one boss and you gain 10 because of all the businesses you work for that are now you're beholden to. But that is just about being intentional and being in a position where not every decision is going to be signed off by someone as a positive, and you kind of just have to block out the noise a little bit, don't you?
On that intentional point, do you have an intention for where you want to, or is it, I know you said obviously you the main purpose for you is that you want to add value, but is there an intention behind where you want to take the business, or are you just seeing how you scale as you go?
More the latter. So I want to niche and focus it more, but I'm also approaching that relatively organically. So rather than kind of second guessing. I'm just trying to say, well, let's speak to as many customers as possible, many prospects as possible. Let's understand where the opportunity is and kind of tighten that as I go through. And I do want to scale it. I want to get it to a point where either through associates and consultants or employees that I can deliver more and not constrained just by me and the hours that I put in. Quite what that model looks like, I'm not sure yet. But I have I don't want it to just continue as a lifestyle consultancy business. I do want to grow it and make sure that it can add value kind of across those pillars that I spoke about.
I guess it goes back to your KPIs point that you kind of have a general maybe gist of where you want to take it, but those things change and you're adapting it as you learn. I think one of the biggest things that comes across for me with you, obviously having known you outside of this, we've talked, met up to the pub, done this podcast, you are much more intentional about your learning than a lot of people that I've come across. I think people who are trying to scale business and they're going to network and events are coming at it from I'm trying to network to win business, which of course you are and of course people are, but I genuinely completely buy into that, and that is genuine from you because I can see it firsthand that you are really trying to actually learn about how to build this successfully, and that's really nice to see, and I think it will hold you in really good stead. Right, so we've run out of time, we better wrap it up there, but that was really interesting conversation, and Alex, we obviously massively appreciate you coming on the podcast. Genuinely insightful, both from how you're starting out, how you're trying to scale, and obviously all the complexities with AI and trying to implement it in businesses. So yeah, massively thanks to you, and yeah, if you want to let our audience know where they can find you, then yeah, please do.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. So yeah, you can find my website is brightkeel.ai. That's BRIGHTKEEL.ai. Very active on LinkedIn. So Alex Bacon, you'll find me on there. And I've also got my own podcast, Scaling with AI. So take a listen to that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll pop your details in below as well. But yeah, thanks for today.
Okay, thank you.